Today on America's Test Kitchen, Julia prepares the best gluten-free pizza. Jack challenges Chris to a tasting of gluten-free spaghetti. And Bridget makes gluten-free chocolate chip cookies. Right here on America's Test Kitchen.
We just spent the better part of 2 years working on gluten-free baked goods. It was the hardest thing we ever did. And we started by doing a taste test of supermarket gluten-free flour blends. The two we really liked were Bob's Red Mill, and we also liked King Arthur flour. Now, the problem is if you buy the supermarket, you're going to spend about twice as much as you would do if you'd made it at home yourself. So we're going to show you how to make our own America's Test Kitchen blend. The first thing is we really liked rice flours. They have a neutral flavor. We use white rice flours, 3 parts white to 1 part of brown rice flour. Brown rice flour has the whole bran. It has some fiber and fat, which we really liked. It helped combat starchiness in the baked goods. Now, the next thing is starch. A lot of people use cornstarch. We didn't like cornstarch. We really did like potato starch. There's also another starch we really like called tapioca starch, and you can get this in most supermarkets. It's really good for developing chew and texture in baked goods. Finally, we moved on to non-fat milk powder. This adds nice browning in the oven as you bake goods. It also helps to combat that starchiness, which is a real problem with gluten-free baking. There is one ingredient we didn't use that a lot of the blends from the supermarket do include. It's called xanthan gum. It works as a glue. It glues the starches to the proteins. The problem is only an 1/8 teaspoon difference in a mix can make a huge difference in a specific recipe. So we decided to leave that out and add it only when needed. So let's head into the test kitchen with Julia and figure out how to make a great gluten-free pizza that you're really going to want to eat. So the sad truth about gluten-free baking is even if you get the flour mix right, you can't just make a regular recipe swapping them out. So we actually tried that with pizza, which, by the way, is the holy grail. I mean, it's the hardest thing you possibly do. Here's the dough. I'll just show it here. This is the dough.
I've seen that before.
And it looks like spackle. I mean, it has no rise. You expect bubbles.
That's right.
There's no elasticity. So now we have to go back to basics.
That's right.
To figure out what to do.
Right. And we found this true for almost every gluten-free recipe we tried. You can't just shove that flour into a recipe and expect it to work. You have to rebuild the recipe from the ground up. So when it comes to pizza, we're going to start with 16 ounces of our ATK gluten-free flour blend. And to this, we're going to add some almond flour. Now, right off the bat, that's very different from a traditional pizza. But early on, when we started testing, the pizzas came out an odd combination of dry and greasy. And that's because gluten-free flour can't really hold on to the oil. Nuts, on the other hand, don't shed their oil. So this is 2.5 ounces of almond flour. Now we're going to add another unusual ingredient. This is ground psyllium husk, and you have some right there. And this is an example of a binder that you find in most gluten-free baked goods. But psyllium is a little different in that it's able to really hold on to water as it bakes, which means the crust stays nice and moist and chewy. Whereas guar gum and xanthan gum are really better for drier things like cookies. So this is 1.5 tablespoons of ground psyllium. Now we're going to add some baking powder. Again, another unusual ingredient for pizza. But again, the dough doesn't have a lot of structure, so it has a hard time hanging on to the yeast bubbles. So we're going to reinforce it with 2 teaspoons. A little bit of salt. This is 2 teaspoons of salt. And finally, a little bit of yeast. Teaspoon of instant yeast. And now we're going to put this on the mixer and let it mix together. Now notice I'm not using a dough hook, I'm using a paddle. And that's because we're going to add so much liquid. This is going to look more like a batter than a dough, and a paddle does a better job. So I'm just going to turn this on low for a minute, let those ingredients mix. Now we're going to add some oil. This is a 1/4 cup of vegetable oil. I'm going to add it very slowly. And finally, we're going to add the water. And again, this is warm water. Should register, around 105, and that helps activate the instant yeast. And this is a lot of water. This is 2.5 cups.
So in bread baking, you say that's very high hydration.
That's right.
Tons of water.
All right, so now that that's nice and well mixed, I'm going to crank up the speed to medium and let it go for 6 minutes. So you can see how different this looks than when we started. It looks like almost a proper dough because those flours have really absorbed the water and the dough has started to build some structure. We're going to cover the bowl with plastic wrap and let it sit at room temperature to let it rise for about 1.5 hours.
Now, we do have to admit this was by far the hardest recipe we've ever done here at the Test Kitchen, and the reason is when you don't have gluten, baking is very difficult. Well, what is gluten? In wheat flour, not other kinds of flour, wheat flour, there are two proteins, gliadin and glutenin, which are inert. They just sit there. But when you add water, they move around and they form a third protein called gluten. If you look under a microscope, those are thin sheets, very elastic sheets, that allows the gas created by yeast to expand and then holds the whole thing in, much like a balloon. With gluten-free flours, it doesn't work very well like rice flours. The reason is there's no gluten, and it's a little bit like sawdust. It doesn't expand, it's not elastic. So what do? Well, you add glue to the dough. That's either xanthan gum, which we didn't use here, or psyllium seed husk. These are large sugar molecules. They're called polysaccharides. And when you hydrate them and mix them mechanically, they start to glue the starches and the proteins and the flours together. It creates a network, and it's not as elastic as regular wheat flour, but it's almost as good. You get some rise, and you get the kind of chew that you'd want in a good pizza.
All right, so this dough has been rising for about an hour and a half, and it rose a little bit physically, but the way to tell when gluten-free breads are really ready for the oven is you want to peek into the dough and see those air bubbles. You can see that the yeast has really started to do its thing and created those nice bubbles.
Well, that first batter I brought out had none of those air bubbles.
It did not, yeah. So obviously this is enough batter for 2 pizzas. 20 ounces is a pizza. All right, so now I'm really going to use this spatula to help spread the dough out onto a rimmed baking sheet. And I'm going to spray it down with some vegetable oil spray. So I'm going to spread it onto this rimmed baking sheet that's lined with parchment and is well sprayed with vegetable oil spray. And using my spatula, I'm just going to sort of press the dough out into an 8-inch round. It's not like regular pizza dough where you can just roll it out with a rolling pin. We use a special technique to get this dough out into a nice thin round to make pizza. All right, so now I'm going to cover this with plastic wrap and use my hands to press this out into a pizza shape that's about 11 inches, 11 and change wide, which is about as wide as this baking sheet, and is about 1/4 of an inch thick. And you want to leave the edge a little bit thicker than the rest so you have a little bit of a crust. All right, so that's one pizza. Now I'm going to move on to the second half of the dough and do another one. Now it's time to bake these. There's so much water in this dough that you can't really just throw some sauce and cheese on it and throw it in the oven and bake a pizza. You really need to drive the moisture out of the dough first. So we're going to par bake these crusts for 40 to 50 minutes in a 325-degree oven. But we're going to start the oven off and turn it on so that it really slowly drives all that moisture out.
Okay. And now Dan is going to talk a little bit more about the interesting science of gluten.
Here in the test kitchen, we've long known that gluten is important in baking, but mainly we've done a lot of talking and not a lot of showing. So what is it on a tangible level? Can you see it? Can you feel gluten? I ran a simple experiment to find out just that. I made 2 basic doughs by mixing flour and water in a food processor. For one dough, I used cake flour, which contains the least amount of protein of all the types you find at the supermarket, usually between 6 and 8%. In addition, cake flour is often bleached, which further weakens the proteins. For the other dough, I used bread flour, which has the most protein, usually running about 12 to 14% protein, and is generally not bleached. The next step, I placed each dough in a mesh strainer and massaged them under running water to wash away all of the starch. Once the water ran clear, which was a sign that the starch was gone, I was left with 2 piles of essentially pure gluten. The low-protein cake flour formed a ball of really small, sticky, weak gluten. On the other hand, the high-protein bread flour formed a ball of highly resilient, rubbery gluten that can be stretched very thin without ripping and tearing. Now, to show just how elastic the bread flour gluten ball is, I'm going to treat it like a balloon and inflate it with helium. So you can see that the bread flour gluten produces a really nice balloon. It gets very, very thin, but still holds all the air. So, what do we learn from this experiment? Well, when we use high-protein bread flour, we're using it for breads because it develops a lot of very flexible gluten. It gives that nice chew that we expect from rustic loaves. For cakes, we want just enough gluten to provide a bit of structure without turning them tough. In that case, we turn to cake flour for its lower protein content and reduced gluten potential. All-purpose flour, as its name suggests, is good for a lot of foods that fall in between these extremes. So, next time you're kneading pizza dough, gently folding a cake batter, or considering swapping one type of flour for the other, I hope you'll remember this experiment. This is one case where seeing really is believing.
So it's been just over 40 minutes, and now it's time to check the pizza crust. So the way you know it's nicely cooked is you want to peek underneath and see that it's slightly golden, which it is. and it's firm to the touch. So we're going to let these cool, and we're going to set the oven up at a 500-degree oven using this baking stone for a good hour. While that's happening, what we have here are some canned tomatoes. These are whole, peeled tomatoes, 28-ounce can, but we drained away the juices with a little bit of olive oil. This is a tablespoon of extra virgin olive oil, a teaspoon of red wine vinegar. This is a teaspoon of dried oregano, and this is half a teaspoon of salt, quarter teaspoon black pepper, and 1 minced garlic clove. So we're just going to process this till it's smooth. It takes about 30 seconds. All right, so that stone has been heating up for an hour, so it's ready to make pizza. And so we're going to take the crust, and you can just lift it right up. It's pretty sturdy and pretty firm. We're only going to add half a cup of sauce. And one thing about this pizza is you really don't want to weigh it down with a lot of sauce and cheese. You want to keep it kind of light. And then just spread it out. And you want to leave a little bit of crust showing on the edge, maybe about 1/4 of an inch or so. All right, so there's your half a cup of sauce. Now we're going to add a little bit of Parmesan, about 1/4 cup of Parmesan, and of course that adds good flavor. And finally, some mozzarella, and this is a cup of shredded whole milk mozzarella. You want to buy the block kind that you shred yourself. Don't get the pre-shredded stuff, because that pre-shredded stuff doesn't melt very well. All right, into the oven on the hot baking stone for about 10 to 12 minutes. So I'm going to let that pizza cool off for about 5 minutes and let it set up. Meanwhile, I'm going to slide pizza number 2 into the oven. All right, so this pizza needs another minute or 2 to cool down before we can slice it open. But in the meanwhile, I have a present for you. We did a pizza for you using the same dough, but without par-baking the crust. Try to pick that up.
Oh.
Oh, awesome.
Well, yeah, it's like the Pillsbury Doughboy.
Yeah.
It's not cooked.
Yeah, you can't even hold
Yeah.
it. And the inside's all gooey.
Okay.
No, you really do
So
need
you absolutely have to par-bake it. Okay.
Absolutely. All right, so this has been resting, and now it's time to give her a taste.
That sounds better, by the way.
Yeah, just a little bit. You can see right off the bat, holds its shape. Now, compared to all those other gluten-free pizzas we tried, this actually has a crusty bottom, has a little bit of crunch. It tastes like real dough.
I would definitely eat this and enjoy it, like I'm doing now.
Exactly.
So there were a lot of tricks and a lot of science. The first was using some almond flour with the rice flours in our blend. The second was to use psyllium seed husk, which really acts as a glue. The third is use a very high hydration dough that uses a lot of water, and we used a paddle to beat it, which actually helped develop that matrix. Then we had to par-cook the pizza in the oven to get rid of some of that excess water, and finally finish it on a pizza stone for 10 or 12 minutes in a 500-degree oven. So there you have it, from America's Test Kitchen to your kitchen, a terrific recipe of the hardest thing we've ever done, gluten-free pizza. For those of you who have to eat gluten-free, when it comes to pasta, that seems pretty tough. So I've asked Jack to go through gluten-free spaghettis to see if there's a brand you would actually enjoy eating.
So I've got 3 samples. They've been boiled with just a little bit of oil to keep them from sticking. 2 things I want you to pay attention to. One is texture. How close to that al dente, springy texture can they get? The truth is, most of the brands don't get that close. They go from mushy to downright slimy or rubbery. Second issue is flavor. Semolina, wheat variety that is used to make Italian-style dried pasta, has a buttery, kind of slightly nutty flavor. What you're looking for is basically something that doesn't have a fence